Prioritising risks. Now, in the world of risk management, trying to work out which of that whole wide array of risks we actually want to start managing, or perhaps even just understanding first, can be really complicated. But we do have a whole variety of different techniques that we can use to help us. Now, perhaps the most famous or the most common tool that we use is by comparing impact, or potential impact of that risk on our objectives against the likelihood of that risk occurring. And we typically draw this in the form of a graph where we have impact along one axis and likelihood up the other axis. Now, different organisations will flick these around so that impact is up the y-axis and vice versa. It really doesn't matter which way you put it, up to you, totally your decision. Now, in terms of this matrix in the middle, some organisations will leave it blank, and so we'll just have a relative scale of generally lower to higher in both angles. Some organisations will split this into 3 different categories of impact and 3 different categories of likelihood. Some organisations will do a 4x4 or a 5x5 or a 99 by 99. Please don't do that. It goes totally mental if you do that. Most organisations will, of course, use a 5x5 grid. But as I said, it doesn't matter what sort of grid you use. If you find that everybody is defaulting to a number 3 or the middle value, then consider using a 4x4 grid or a 6x6, because then there is no fence for people to sit on. Now, with regards to this, often people will use some form of descriptive words to describe what is meant by a low impact through to a high impact, and similarly on the likelihood scale. So very unlikely to kind of likely, maybe likely, yes it's likely, and very likely up the top. Again, it doesn't matter what sort of language you use. There's lots of different guidance out there, but you just need to make sure that it works for your organisation and fits in with your organisational culture. Once we've got that in place, then what we might start to do on the impact scale is start to measure our risks in terms of an array of different criteria. Now, depending on what our organisation does, there will be different things that will impact on us to a different level. Now, for example, if you work in heavy industry, often you will have something like health and safety will be one of those types of criteria that you might use. You might also use something like money. You might also think about reputation. You might think about the legal or the compliance side of things. All of these different things here can be different types of criteria that we use. Now, it's really important that you work out what is important or what sort of impacts could be important to your organisation, because your organisation is unique. And if you just do a copy and paste from someone else, there's going to be something that doesn't quite work for you and the risks that you're trying to help your organisation to manage. Now, if we take health and safety as an example, depending on what our organisation does, what we typically do is we say that over here in the highest category, this is what sort of thing might happen that would seriously disrupt what we're trying to do. It might be game over for our business, it might cause us to change our strategy as a whole, or it might be something that actually just breaches one of our values that we have as an organisation. So often what we will have over here will be that loss of life or that fatality, or perhaps if we're in a particularly dangerous sector, it might be a multiple fatality that we have over here in that highest category. So if we put fatality up here over on the highest side, of course assuming that what we're talking about here are just threats rather than bringing in the opportunity side as well. Now, back over on the left-hand side where we're talking about that lowest type of impact, this is something where we care about it, but it's not really going to change much within our organisation. So we're looking for a level of impact that, yes, we'll notice, but we're not going to be too worried about. So this might be something like a first aid case that we would have over here. Now, what we do in these intermediary cells is then work out what kind of things could happen in the middle, and we might use a logarithmic scale or a linear scale. It really doesn't matter as a whole, so long as you have something that shows the difference between your first aid case up to that fatality. If we take another example, so say for example money, this is something here where, again, depending on the scale of our organisation, we might just go for raw numbers. So we might say, okay, this could be $1 billion. Okay, so perhaps if we lose $1 billion, that's going to cause our company to go bust. That'd be nice. Or perhaps it's going to change our strategy as a whole. All the way down to a sum of money that, yeah, again, we'll notice, but we're not going to worry too much about. So that might be, I don't know, $10,000, for example. And again, in these particular intervening cells, we might use an exponential curve or perhaps a linear scale. It really doesn't matter. Now, sometimes if organisations are trying to scale this particular matrix up or down throughout their organisation, the money bit becomes really difficult, because if you are trying to go from your group level down to a particular project, $1 billion is suddenly way too much for that highest level of scale, because there's no way that project's ever going to see $1 billion, let alone stand the chance of potentially losing it. And so this is something where, instead of using raw numbers, sometimes what people use is actually a percentage of revenue or equivalent sort of metric within the financial world. And what you can do there is then allow the same scale to be used for really big stuff within your business as well as really small stuff, because you've now made it relative. As the risk manager, you will then be able to normalize what's going on in the background, because of course you know what the revenue is for all of those different bits of the organization that you're asking to be able to use this matrix as a whole. We can then work our way through reputation, which is often measured in terms of customer satisfaction or perhaps share price, or sometimes even the media. So what kind of media presence, for example, or excitement might a particular risk have? Legal is often the proxy for compliance, for example, and there's a whole array of other types of consequences or impacts that we might have that we might want to measure. Now, up the y-axis, this is where we talk about likelihood, and likelihood can be really, really difficult. Often we measure it in terms of frequency or perhaps percentage chance or time, for example. So we might have something up here which would be once every day. Is the potential for it to occur, whereas down in the low it might be once every 30 years. Again, depending on what your organisation does, you need to make sure that this scale is appropriate for you. So this is how you could go about building an impact against likelihood matrix. Now, within this, in the central matrix bit, lots of organisations then start to colour in that top right-hand corner red, and then perhaps the middle bit being amber, and the bottom left-hand corner being green. And in fact, if there was a logo for risk management around the world, it is probably going to be that red, amber, green. The problem that we have, though, is that actually within our organisations, depending on how we've set up these scales, we may well have risks that we're quite happy to leave in that top right-hand corner. And so therefore, we're happy for them to be up there. They're not big, scary risks. Also, we may have risks that actually we can never get into that bottom left-hand corner, because it's just not possible to either reduce that impact or that likelihood to manage them to that extent. And this is the case here, where when you see, especially senior leaders, saying things like, I don't want any red risks, or I want everything to be green. If you're facing that problem, then one of the easiest solutions is just to get rid of the colours, because it means that that person doesn't truly understand what our impact against likelihood matrix is about, and it will certainly simplify the discussions that you're trying to drive within your organisation. Now, in terms of working out what we put on this scale, this is where we can use a variety of different types of risk rating. We can either rate our risks based on where they might be if there were no controls in place whatsoever to manage that risk or manage the potential of that risk happening. So that is sometimes called our total risk rating. It can also be called our gross risk rating, or our inherent risk rating, or our raw risk rating. There's lots of different words that we can use for this. So that's the risk if we have no controls in place. We then quite often talk about our current risk rating, and our current risk rating is where is that risk right now, given the current effectiveness of controls that we have in place right this second. So that's usually called our current risk rating. Sometimes it's called our net risk rating, and sometimes it's called our residual risk rating. However, caveat with regards to residual, because there's also a second definition for residual, and that second definition, which sometimes we come across in organisations, is where would that risk be if all of the controls that we had designed were actually in place and working 100%. And I'm sure many of you can think of controls that someone's designed, but they haven't quite put in place yet, so therefore that risk hasn't necessarily seen the benefit of those particular controls. So sometimes that risk rating is also called residual, okay? And so therefore we end up with this mass confusion with regards to the word residual, because it can either mean where are we right now, given the current effectiveness of the controls that we've got, or it can mean where would we be if all of those controls that we have designed were in place and working. And this confusion has led to massive problems inside different organisations, because 50% of people will assume that you're meaning one definition for the word residual, and the other 50% will assume that you're using the other definition for the word residual. So therefore, what I suggest is you get rid of the word residual, therefore eliminating this confusion, and decide, do you want to go for your current effectiveness or your current control rating, so where are you right now, or do you want to be using something different? Now, the fourth risk rating that we sometimes come across, and actually increasingly come across, is the target risk rating. So where do you want to push that risk to? Now, sometimes that target risk rating is synonymous or the same as your risk appetite. So where are you willing to push that risk to? It is not necessarily into that green zone in the bottom left-hand corner of your risk matrix, because there may well be lots of risks that you're quite happy sitting up in the amber or in the red zone. So this is another reason why I would encourage you to think about getting rid of your red, amber and green ratings. Now, if we explore those ratings a little bit further, this is something where we can say, okay, so if I have an inherent risk rating, sometimes known as our total risk rating, often if it is a big scary risk, it might be up in that top left-hand corner. Now then what we might want to plot is, okay, where is our target? So where do we want to push that risk to? As I said, sometimes organisations say it always needs to be over here. But that's not always possible. In fact, it's rarely possible. Most often, actually, you're either in the same column with regards to your impact, or only somewhere over, a little bit over towards the left. So our target risk rating might be there. The most useful risk rating, of course, that we have is that current risk rating. And that will usually be somewhere between our inherent and our target, because there's usually something that we haven't quite managed to put in place yet, or we haven't maintained to the right level, so that control's not necessarily working. So this might be the usual trajectory that we'd see a risk moving through. Now, if you want to simplify this, and i.e. reduce the number of risk ratings that you might be recording in your risk register, a good way of doing it is to think, okay, well, who are we recording the information for? If you're recording the information for an auditor, they always like to know what that inherent or that total risk rating is, because they will always be wanting to measure back against what is that potential maximum impact that you might be looking at. Okay, so they will be wanting to look at where is that inherent risk rating and how well do we think those controls are working to get to your current position where you are right now. Now, conversely, if you're a risk manager, actually you're not too bothered about that total or that inherent risk rating. What you're more concerned with is where are you right now and where do you want to get to? So where are you sitting right this second, given the current control effectiveness of what's going on round about you, and where is that risk target or that risk appetite that you're trying to get to as a whole? So if you're trying to reduce the number of risk ratings that you've got as a whole, you really need to consider Who are you collecting this information for? Is it for auditors? Is it for risk managers? Is it for the people who are truly managing the risk? And if that's the case, it's probably current against target. And only then do you want to simplify down or choose which risk ratings you're going for as a whole. Now, just to test this, if we have a situation where our current and our target are overlapping, that's great news for us because it means that actually we put enough controls in place and now all we need to do is carry on maintaining them. If, however, we end up with a situation a bit like this, okay, so our current risk rating, assuming that this is a threat, our current risk rating is below that of our target, this suggests that actually maybe we're doing too much to manage that risk. So perhaps we can see some efficiencies by taking our foot off the gas a little bit and moving our current risk rating back up to within our target. Okay. This is also something here where if we land up in this situation, if we'd coloured in our risk matrix red, amber, green, people would still be talking about this risk despite the fact that we don't actually need to be taking any more action with regards to it. Which leads me on to my final point, which is if we end up with a situation over here where, for example, we may actually have a risk which is well outside our red zone, but we've got a big journey that we need to take it on in order to get it into its target area or into its risk appetite. Those are the risks that often we need to escalate or elevate to our decision makers because they're the ones that we really want to do something about. So the final thought that I'd like to leave you with is when somebody asks us, what are our top 5 risks? Are those risks always the ones that are in our top right-hand corner? Or could they more usefully be the ones where actually we've got a really big distance between our current risk rating and our target risk rating?